Record.
You're kinder than me.
You're all kind. Okay, let me see. View slideshow. There we go. Daniel 11 part 3. So looks like we're going to end up doing this in 4 parts. But anyway, so we're going to get into the time where like Antiochus Epiphanes is actually going to roll into Jerusalem for the first time. He kind of rolls into Jerusalem a couple times, and so there's it's not just a one-time thing where he came and did all his shenanigans. This whole story is a little bit in layers, and Daniel 11 gives you some kind of like gives you one outline, a prophetic outline about it. You can read historical accounts, which kind of give you more of like what was going on politically with Antiochus at the time. And then, of course, the Jews had their own account of what was going on, especially in Jerusalem at the time. So there's, several layers to the story and several ways of telling it. But just to kind of like give a recap of where we were. It's been a couple of weeks since we've done this Bible study, but so from the time from Daniel is writing chapter 11 from Cyrus's time. So it's already in the time of the Persian Empire. And the prophecy is going to predict 4 more kings in Persia, the 4th one who's going to be Xerxes. And Xerxes ends up stirring up the Greeks by attacking them. And Alexander manages to kind of get the Greeks united under himself, and he attacks the Persians and conquers, a massive territory. Of course, not just Persia, but he gets a hold of a big territory. And so when Alexander dies, of course, there's 5 generals that he leaves behind. His he had a brother who was kind of incapable, a son that was born out of wedlock, and another one who was born after he had passed away. So he ends up not having a successor from his own family, but 5 generals end up kind of fighting over their territory. Now, one of them, his name is either Antigones or Antigones. He tries to reunite all of the areas that Alexander had. He tries to unite the empire again, but instead, what happens is that the 4 other rulers, a couple of them gang up against Antigones, but it ends up being split into 4 between the 4 rulers. They get rid of Antigones. So here again are the 4 areas, and then you've got Israel, the area of Jerusalem, kind of like between the Seleucus and Ptolemies, and because of its position, of course, it's a trade route, a key trade route, because everything going from Africa into Asia Minor goes through there, and then a lot of because of the port, which is Joppa, it's one of the best ports that you could use at the time, because up here it's kind of there's a lot of mountains and cliffs and everything, and even if you can find a good port, you'd still have to traverse over mountains and things to get out of there. And then south of there into Egypt, you end up with a lot of marshes and just territory that's not great to travel on. So they were in a key position. Now, they fight over, and I mentioned, that they do fight a lot over the area of Jerusalem, but they also made a lot of pacts. They made accords and agreements, and had arranged marriages and signed treaties and all kinds of things, just to kind of try to solve that problem all the time. But Jerusalem was a sticking point in that area, just as it's a sticking point nowadays. So Daniel 11 focuses just on those two areas, mostly just the Ptolemies in the south and the Seleucids in the north. Um, and Jerusalem would mostly be under the Ptolemies until the Seleucids would briefly gain control over it under Antiochus III, and that was in 217 BC. That was kind of a short stint, and then at the same year, Ptolemy the fourth regained Israel and was so stoked. That was back in the south, so the south or Egypt lost it for briefly under Antiochus III, but then Ptolemy the fourth regains Israel, and he's so elated that with his win that he spends the rest of his life partying, kind of like in a drunken stupor. And Antiochus III, up in the north, after losing this battle, he actually spends 14 years building his empire in the north, getting stronger and stronger while Ptolemy IV parties on. And he returned and he retook Jerusalem. And a number of Jews assisted him, and he received the hero's welcome. So even though the Ptolemies had been pretty good in the south overall, they had gotten kind of fed up with this this Ptolemy because he was, so debaucherous, and they didn't like him. And so Antiochus, in comparison, looked like a hero, but them receiving Antiochus III was going to end up being their downfall. So Antiochus III, he gets overconfident after and he gets overconfident about fighting the Romans. So he takes on the Romans, but he's not successful, and he ends up owing them a bunch of money. So he owes them tribute. Now he's got to pay taxes to the Romans. And so when he dies, his son Seleucus IV takes over, and because he still owes tribute to the Romans, he's going to try to tax the Jews really heavily. And he sends his prime minister Heliodorus to collect tax from the temple, because he gets this rumor started by this trader named Jason, that there's all this money being held back from Seleucus in the temple. Of course, it's money that's been held there in good faith to try to, for widows and orphans, and also just by people who wanted to, give to the Lord. And the priest, who's Ananias, did not want to. He didn't see that it wasn't right to give this as a tax to Seleucus. So what happens is that this Heliodorus, who's going to try to get the taxes, of course, when he goes in, the story is here that he is confronted by this rider, this kind of like this divine apparition within the temple, and then and that these other angels or whatever whip him and basically chase him out. They thrash him to within an inch of his life, and he barely escapes with his life. And he goes back and tells Seleucus, if you've got any enemies, send them, because they're going to get a thrashing too. So here's here's a painting, that you can find in the Vatican of this story. It's in the Maccabees, and there's Onias praying. Onias is going to come up again in our story, and so is Heliodorus. Heliodorus actually would later he would become a ruler in Jerusalem, and he would and so like his shenanigans aren't really over yet. But so we're up to verse 21 in chapter 11. It says, in his place, that means in Seleucid's place, will arise a contemptible person. So now we're finally getting to Antiochus Epiphanes, to whom royal majesty has not been given. In other words, Seleucus IV, it's going to be his brother. It shouldn't be his brother. It should be his sons, right? Or one of his sons. But instead, Antiochus is going to weasel his way to the throne. So, to whom royal majesty has not been given, he shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Antiochus is going to he's going to flatter some people and kind of talk himself up, and he's going to weasel his way to the throne. So Lucas had two sons. They should have been his heirs, but the oldest, his name's Demetrius, he was in prison in Rome. And then Heliodorus, the tax collector, the guy who got the thrashing by the angels, he actually ended up seizing the throne supposedly in the name of the younger brother Antiochus. So this is another Antiochus. This isn't Antiochus Epiphanes. There's a lot of Antiochuses, but you only get like a number after your name if you're a ruler, right? So this guy would have been Antiochus IV if his older brother Demetrius wasn't going to take the throne, and for some reason, and then he should have been the second in line for, to receive the throne from his father Seleucus IV. But what instead happens is that you've got Demetrius in prison, and then Heliodorus weasels his way to the throne in the name of the younger brother. Like, he's too young to rule, I should be ruling, and he actually he's kind of a figure himself who's into flattery and all kinds of shenanigans himself, but he is actually kind of on the throne himself right before Antiochus Epiphanes weasels his way to the throne. So Antiochus IV, he had actually been in prison in Rome himself, but when he got out, he seized the throne in the name of Demetrius, the older son, and Heliodorus fled. So he scares off Heliodorus basically, and that's kind of like how we get rid of Heliodorus. But it's not good news anyway, because Antiochus IV is now illegitimately on the throne. Antiochus Epiphanes is Antiochus IV. Yeah. So this is the way Antiochus. Yeah, he's a usurper. He takes over the throne instead of his nephew, basically, and he's kind of doing it with the pretense that, like, oh, I'm kind of ruling in his stead because he can't be here right now. But he's got no intention of giving up the throne. So Guzik in his note says he shall come in peaceably. Apart from the murder of his older brother, Antiochus IV didn't use terror, so he didn't like kill a bunch of people or anything to gain power. He used flattery, smooth promises, and intrigue. And oh, watch out! Here's Aaron. Hey, what's up? So he comes in, using smooth tongue, intrigue. Clark, who's this older commentator, he rattles off like a bunch of people who Antiochus had flattered. He flattered Eumenes, the king of Pergamus, Attalus, his brother, got their assistance. A lot of these people, I don't know who they are. He flattered the Romans. He sent ambassadors to court their favor, pay them arrears of the tribute. He flattered the Syrians and gained their concurrence. So there's a lot of history. This guy did a lot of stuff, and we're not going to go into all of it, for obvious reasons. He had a bit of a career, and he did a lot of stuff, but he involved himself in a lot of flattery and kind of tricked his way into ruling. So this is Guzik is one of the commentators I've been reading. So verse 22, it says, armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken. Now that's kind of a summary statement because he doesn't win every battle. And we'll get into some of the things that he loses. But he will be overall a tyrant, and he will win some key battles. He's actually going to not just win Jerusalem, but he is going to even take over Egypt. He's going to have the Egyptian Ptolemies under his thumb. So this guy's going to end up doing more than what his fathers had done. It was usually they would fight over that area between Syria and modern day Israel, but this time he was going to like actually take over a lot of Egypt. So it's a mixed analysis. Antiochus launched massive campaigns, but he's not always successful. Now it says here that even the Prince of the Covenant, when it's talking about the Prince of the Covenant, again, it's talking about Onias. Onias is that priest who did not want taxes to be taken out of the temple. Remember, when Heliodorus went and got his butt kicked by those angels and that horseman or whatever. So that was Onias.
Alexander the Great was coming.
No, this is after. This is afterwards. This is when the Seleucus IV had tried to get taxes from the temple, and then he sends this guy Heliodorus to collect the taxes. But then he gets. Were you here when we did this? Yeah, that whole story, right? So this is what happened. Now, this is a story that we got into a couple chapters ago. Onias, the high priest, who's a good high priest, right? He has a brother named Jason, who's a treacher, and he bribes Antiochus for the office of the high priest, and Antiochus had Onias removed. So Jason, the brother of the legitimate high priest, basically gets the high priest position by bribery. And so later on, and it turns out to be it looks like another brother of Jason's and Onias, this guy named Menelaus. He offers an even bigger bribe, and he got the office, and he robbed the temple. Now Menelaus is going to end up being awful, okay? But already you're starting with a situation where like you don't even have like a legitimate high priest anymore. I think they're probably, as far as I know, they had all been legitimate high priests up until this time, and now this is all getting destroyed. So Onias ends up Menelaus. Let me say something. Menelaus, he robs the temple, and it looks like partially to pay for this bribe. I'm not really sure about that. But he does rob the temple, or he has this guy named I forget his name to rob it for him. And Onias finds out about this, and Onias, the ex-high priest, he protests this, and then Menelaus actually has him killed because of this. And it's going to cause kind of an outrage in Jerusalem. So this is from Second Maccabees, and I'm kind of like going back and forth from Maccabees. So we're coming into this this period where all this takes place between Onias and Menelaus and Jason. Okay, so when Seleucus IV had died, and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, we know now by, illegitimately, but he succeeds him in the king. Then Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king at an interview 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue, 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, and to enroll the men of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. So what Jason is doing is that he is, not only is he going to allow Antiochus to Hellenize Jerusalem, he's actually paying and bribing Antiochus for Jerusalem to be Hellenized, right? And kind of the idea is like, I'm going to Hellenize Jerusalem, and then in exchange, can they also be basically Greek citizens or citizens of Antioch, which is the headquarters for the Seleucid Empire. So that they are not just like an area within the Seleucids, but they are actually now going to be Seleucid citizens, right? So he wants to get a gymnasium there. Now we think, wow, gymnasium, no big deal, but for them, like those games were done in honor of Zeus, so he's going to like corrupt them into like this whole Greek way of life.
Almost had like a temple aspect to it, kind of in a way too.
Yeah, and they wrestled naked, and it was like all this glorification of the body, and the whole mindset is just like foreign to what the Jews stood for.
And where it says like a body of youth, is that almost like they're going to be slaves then? Like,
I don't know what he means by that. I'm not really sure. So like, can you send me some athletes, or I don't know. I don't know what he means. So when the king assented, so Antiochus says yes, and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his countrymen over to the Greek way of life. For with alacrity, so he does this all, happily, or whatever. Alacrity, I'm sorry, alacrity. Alacrity, yeah. I'm being, what do you call it, dyslexic there. For with alacrity, he founded a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. I guess the Greek hat is a Peleus, is what it's called. There was such an extreme of Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their services at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hastened to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the call to the discus. So we're seeing a whole corruption of the whole priesthood here. All these priests were going along with this, and they abandoned their kind of stations, and they all started participating in this. Yeah. So disdaining, well, the Olympics comes from this, yeah. Disdaining the honors prized by their fathers and putting the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. Now get this, for this reason, heavy disaster overtook them, and those whose ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies and punished them. So they totally turned on the people that they had admired before. So now it's like they've gone secular, so to speak, and now they're going to actually disdain and punish the people who they used to, the religious leaders and that they had before, and the people that they admired. For it is no light thing to show irreverence to the divine laws, a fact which later events will make clear. So already you're seeing from the Maccabees that that their explanation for the reason that all of this happened was because Israel corrupted from the inside. In other words, this wouldn't have happened just out of the blue. And that's kind of like one of the things that like we kind of overlook in this story, or tend to overlook. Daniel himself is praying, is saying, we're out here in exile because of our sin. So these things are happening. The Jews are looking at their history and saying, these things happened because we've sinned. We went into exile because of sin, and we had other things go wrong later on, and it's because of our sin. So and AD 70 later on, after Jesus's time, when the Romans would ransack Jerusalem, that's because of the Christians understood, because of them, their sin in rejecting their Messiah. So it's all sort of these things don't just happen in a vacuum. So anyway, when the quadrennial games were being held at Tyre and the king was present, the vile Jason was the guy who usurped he's the the briber, he sent envoys chosen as being Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem to carry 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. Those who carried the money, however, thought best not to use it for a sacrifice because that was inappropriate, but to expend it for another purpose. So this money was intended by the sender for the sacrifice to Hercules, but by the decision of its carriers, it was applied to the construction of triremes, which are ships. So when Apollonius, the son of Menestheus, Menestheus was sent to Egypt for the coronation of Philometor as king. Antiochus learned that Philometor had become hostile to his government. I'm going to kind of skip over this part, but really what's happening here is that Antiochus is going to leave Jerusalem and go to the south. So he's kind of jumping in and out of town a couple times. So the part he's hearing about something that's happening and he's going to go down to take care of it. But in the meantime, what he does is that he comes through Jerusalem. So he arrives at Joppa, the nearby port, and he proceeded to Jerusalem. He was welcomed magnificently by Jason and the city. So the Jerusalem's just already like welcoming Antiochus Epiphanes here. He's like, they're giving him all these accolades. Yay, Antiochus, welcome to Jerusalem. He hasn't ransacked it yet, but like he's their big friend right now, right? He was welcomed magnificently by Jason and the city and ushered in with a blaze of torches and with shouts. Then he marched into Phoenicia. So they've become Hellenized. And here's Antiochus Epiphanes who gave them this stadium, and we're just so happy to be all Hellenized, and Antiochus is our hero, So Menelaus, he becomes high priest. So after a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon. So this is actually here it's recording him not as the brother of Jason, but Simon. Simon is the guy who told Seleucus, "Oh, there's golden temple. You should take it because they owe you taxes," right? So Simon's the another not so nice guy. So he is actually, I guess, the brother of Simon, not of Jason. Somebody I got that information from Guzik. I'll blame that on Guzik. Anyway, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon to carry the money to the king and to complete the records of essential business. But he, when presented to the king, extolled him with an air of authority. So what happened is Menelaus is being sent, right? But when he goes to bring this money to the king, he says, "Oh, I can actually be an even better high priest because I can bribe you with even more money." And I don't know if he even pretended that he was bringing the money on his own account. But he, when presented to the king, extolled the king with the air of authority, or he extolled him, like as being like he's something special, and secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. After receiving the king's orders, he returned possessing no qualifications for the high priesthood, but having the hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage wild beast. So Jason, who after supplanting his own brother, was supplanted by another man and was driven as a fugitive into the land of Ammon. Ammon is like modern day Jordan. And Menelaus held the office, but he did not pay regularly any of the money promised to the king. So he bribed Antiochus, but he never paid him. So Stratus, the captain of the citadel, kept requesting payment for the collection of the revenue was his responsibility. The two of them were summoned by the king on account of this issue. Menelaus left his own brother Lysimachus as deputy in the high priesthood. So Menelaus is going to leave town. So Stratus is going to leave somebody else in charge, and actually Antiochus is going to leave somebody else in charge. They're all going to kind of like do their own traveling and go somewhere else while, they got somebody else in charge. But this Menelaus, he kind of like, he leaves Jerusalem. He leaves this guy Lysimachus. That's his own brother, right? He's going to end up being another, stinker too. So as deputy as the high priest, while Sostratus left Crates and the commander of the Cyprian troops. While such was the state of affairs, it happened that the people of Tarsus and Malus revolted because their cities had been given as a present to Antiochus, the king's concubine. So Antiochus had this concubine named Antiochus and gives these two cities as a present to her, and the people don't like it. Tarsus and Malus are kind of like they launch a revolt. So now Antiochus, the king, went hastily to settle the trouble, leaving Andronicus, a man of high rank, and to act as his deputy. So everybody's got their deputies in place. But Menelaus, thinking he had obtained a suitable opportunity, stole some of the gold vessels of the temple and gave them to Andronicus. Other vessels, as it happened, he had sold to Tyre and the neighboring cities. So when Onias became aware of these acts, he publicly exposed them, having first withdrawn to a place of sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch. Therefore, Menelaus, taking Andronicus aside, urged him to kill Onias. So Onias is here, like, gonna get the legitimate high priest Onias killed.
Okay, the concubine.
That's
So her name is,
Antiochus,
but
not Antiochus. So this is IS, not US, probably.
Or he was like, well,
Like
your
the
name's
the
mine,
far-
you should be my concubine.
Yeah. It's just like the feminine version of the same name. Yeah, seems like it, right? Yeah.
I wonder what that would mean, like giving her the cities, like.
Yeah, just as
Is the tax dollars from them, or what does that mean?
well, it's kind of like like what was that that one guy, he had his wife, what was her name again?
Beatrice.
Beatrice, no, not Beatrice, but one of the early kings in this story. He Laodice. Yeah, Laodice. Laodicea is named after Laodice. So it's kind of like like there's they were actually naming cities after their wives or lovers or giving them as gifts. So here's how much I care about you. I'm giving these two cities who to you, even though they don't like it at all. So he comes to Andronicus, came to Onias, and resorting to treachery, offered him sworn pledges and gave him his right hand, and in spite of his suspicions, persuaded Onias to come out. So this guy actually, he tricks Onias into coming out of hiding from the place of his sanctuary. Then, with no regard for justice, he immediately put him out of the way. So he kills him. For this reason, not only the Jews, but also many also of other nations were grieved and displeased at the unjust murder of the man, because Onias, even though he wasn't high priest, people still revered him. When the king returned to the region of Cilicia, the Jews in the city appealed to him with regards to the unreasonable murder of Onias, and the Greeks also shared their hatred of the crime. Therefore, Antiochus was grieved at heart. I don't know if he's genuinely grieved or if he's just acting that way, but it just says here, Antiochus was grieved at heart and filled with pity and wept because of the moderation of good conduct of the deceased. In other words, he knew that Onias was a good man, right? And inflamed with anger, he immediately stripped off the purple robe from Andronicus, tore off his garments, and led him about the whole city to that very place where he had committed the outrage against Onias, and there he dispatched the bloodthirsty fellow. The Lord thus repaid him with the punishment he deserved. So I can't tell if Antiochus is like doing this all for political reasons, if he's genuinely crying about it, or if at that time he's just, like even the worst people have like a sense of like, hey, this is not right and whatever. So it's kind of a strange like a strange part of the story, right? Well, no, Antiochus is the one who's going to end up like killing all these Jews and stuff. But the guy that's Andronicus.
But Antiochus also took the bribe to get Onias out though, right?
Antiochus also, yeah, he took the bribe.
But he's like, hey, I was.
Yeah, he was okay. He was okay with like removing Onias. He didn't have Onias killed, but he was like, well, okay, money talks, and so maybe he liked Onias, but he was like, but like I'm not getting any money from it, so I'd rather have somebody that I can manipulate and control, and who's all into Hellenization. So I'm going to put him in control. But he may have actually secretly sort of respected Onias.
Yeah, like he didn't want to kill him.
Yeah, like he didn't, he's like, well, I didn't want to see that happen to the guy because he probably thought of he may have actually thought highly of Onias, so I don't know. Looks like it. So in any case, Andronicus gets his. When many acts of sacrilege had been committed in the city by Lysimachus. Lysimachus is the guy who Menelaus left in charge as his deputy, his own brother, right? So this is Menelaus's brother. When many acts of sacrilege had been committed in the city by Lysimachus with the connivance of Menelaus, and when the report of them had spread abroad, the populace gathered against Lysimachus because many of the gold vessels had already been stolen. So it's like Lysimachus and Menelaus, those brothers, were behind a lot of the theft of the temple, right? And since the crowds were becoming aroused and filled with anger, Lysimachus armed about 3,000 men and launched an unjust attack under the leadership of a certain Aranus, a man advanced in years and no less advanced in folly. So it's a stupid old guy. But when the Jews became aware of Lysimachus' attack, some picked up stones, some blocks of wood, others took handfuls of the ashes that were lying about and threw them in wild confusion at Lysimachus and his men. As a result, they wounded many of them and killed some, and they put them all to flight. And the temple robber himself, who I think is Lysimachus, or maybe they paid somebody to do this, they killed close by the treasury. I'm pretty sure the robber himself is Lysimachus. So charges were brought against Menelaus about this incident. And when the king came to Tyre, 3 men sent by the Senate presented the case before him. But Menelaus, already as good as beaten, promised a substantial bribe to Ptolemy, the son of Dorymenes, to win over the king. So now Menelaus is going to bribe the king of the south. So he's already bribed Antiochus, but now he's going to actually bribe Ptolemy, son of Dorymenes, to win over the king. Well, actually, this isn't the Ptolemy king, but he's going to bribe this guy who's close to the king. So therefore, Ptolemy, taking the king aside into the colony as if for refreshment, induced the king to change his mind. Wait a minute. This is a guy named Ptolemy, but I think we're talking about here is the king. It would be Antiochus. I'm not really sure. Menelaus, the cause of all this evil, he acquitted on the charges against him, while he sentenced to death those unfortunate men who would have been freed uncondemned if they had pleaded even before the Scythians. So the guys who were going after Menelaus saying this is not right, they end up being killed. Menelaus just walks though. And so those who had spoken for the city and the villages and the holy vessels quickly suffered the unjust penalty. Therefore, even the Tyrians, showing their hatred for the crime, provided magnificently for the funeral. So there's a lot of sympathy going around, and even these other pagan towns are pitching in for the funeral of these Jewish guys, because they just think this whole thing stinks. But Menelaus, because of the cupidity of those in power, remained in office, growing in wickedness, having become the chief plotter against his fellow citizens. So that's that kind of like part of the story. Now we're back to Daniel 13. Yeah, I mean Daniel 11.
Yeah.
Cupidity. Yeah.
I've looked up like 4 words.
Right. Yeah. This is. Yeah. Greed, avarice.
Yeah, it's just like greed.
Yeah.
Yeah, the language in here is like some.
Yeah, I don't think it's any easier than the King James, honestly. Next
It's
time I
like
should.
slightly different though.
It's slightly
Because
different.
it's not like the haves and the thous.
It's not the haves and the thous. It's pretty fancy
It's just a
wording.
lot of vocabulary.
Yeah,
Not necessarily.
Well, now, from now on.
they should do a they should do a the message version of Mac.
So what century was all this written in, probably?
This is probably between 150 and well, not much longer after 150.
So basically like maybe 100 years and 150 years after they came back from Babylon
This,
and 150 years.
oh no. This is like 100, maybe like 100 years before Christ.
Yeah.
So this
but
is what.
wasn't there only like 300 or 400 years between Babylon and Christ?
Oh no, Babylon is like Daniel's writing from like the 600s.
Oh, I thought it was more
6 and 5. I think the some of these like the Alexander the Great was what, around 300.
And this is like maybe 150.
This is getting close to 150. Yeah, this is like 160.
So it's like a third of the way from Babylon, like 2/3 from Babylon to Jesus, basically.
Yeah, this is getting pretty close. So I don't think there's like a big window that the Maccabees could have been written in. So it had to have been after these events, but before. This is Second Temple literature right before Christ. So I don't.
Britannica.com, which I don't know if it's reputable.
Uh,
It was possibly written during the reign of the Roman Emperor Caligula during 37 to 41.
80
Um,
or BC.
well, this says CE. I know.
Yeah, what is the CE?
It's because it's like a atheist way of saying it. It's
Common
like they
era,
don't want to
common
put.
Common era.
Yeah.
I'm surprised the Scottish made it down there for.
The what? The Maccabees.
Maccabees. They always sound like a Scottish name.
Maccabees. The Maccabees.
Too, like
As Judas Maccabee. They're gonna come later in the story. So
So all of that is from verse.
so not too far from either way, not too far from the from when Jesus,
It's good to paint the picture of what he was born into,
yeah. But because Jesus is already participating, he was participating in the feast of rededication or feast of dedication, which came from the Maccabean revolt and the story of Hanukkah. I mean, where Hanukkah comes from, Antiochus Epiphanes is like around 160, 150 BC.
So you're wondering who's the
The
guy that trashed?
destruction was.
The destruction, that's not Antiochus, that's the Romans. That's Vespasian or that's Titus.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the Roman era.
Yeah, it's like you almost need a key of everyone's name and who they are.
Yeah. So there's like a couple of like big. So when you're talking about the abomination causes desolation, we're talking about like this, but Jesus is also talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which was still future to him. So he uses, yeah. So from the time that an alliance is made with Antiochus, he shall act deceitfully and shall become strong with a small people. So we're gonna kind of like go back in time to like how he became strong. So the north and the south had always been fighting over Coelus, Syria. That's, you may know it as Coelestra. You may have seen that like in, I think it's mentioned in Acts or something. And Palestine, they typically had an agreement concerning these areas. Ptolemy had no intent to keep these agreements. He would pretend to make visits to Egypt for the good of Ptolemy, but he was picking off areas with a smaller force to stay a little under the radar. So while he's like on his way to and from Ptolemy, like to talk and hang with him and, you know, yuck it up, he's just kind of like, he's taking a small force and picking off this little area, that little area, and he's just picking off areas within Egypt.
We're talking about two Ptolemies right there.
Yeah, so this is this would be I think this is Ptolemy IV still. So,
Ptolemy is more like a title. No.
yeah, so well, it was a name, you know, like, and you could be named, but in any case, because the original Ptolemy was somebody by the name Ptolemy. There were a number of Ptolemies, but if you're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you're talking about the rulers that were named Ptolemy, but they were all named Ptolemy in the south. So in the north, it was you were either Seleucus number whatever, or you were Antiochus whatever number. So, but at the south, it was all Ptolemies, which makes it a little easier in
Like
the
they were
south.
born with that?
Well, they were just kind of like, it was just kind of like, yeah, King Edward III, King James the whatever, you know.
Like upon their coronation, they now are named,
No, I think that their actual names were like,
they're born with them,
yeah, you're the king's son, so you're going to be the next, you know.
right?
Yeah. But he was picking off areas with a small force. So without warning or peaceably in some versions, he shall come into the richest parts of the province that's in Egypt, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. So Barnes, he says he would make gradual and artful approaches until he had seized upon the best portions of the land. And he took control of a lot of Egypt and rewarded his followers with their spoils. So he was looting Egypt and then giving his followers basically the spoils. And he laid siege on Memphis and Alexandria, but he was forced out by the threat of the Romans. So he doesn't. So he was being successful against the Ptolemies, but he couldn't really withstand Rome that well. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for the plot shall be devised against him. It's basically Antiochus is going to invade the south with a big force eventually. And he's going to be met with a big force from the south, but there's going to be some backhandedness within the south where Ptolemy is not going to be successful against Antiochus. So when Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established, he determined to become the king of the land of Egypt, that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he invaded Egypt with a strong force. This is from Maccabees 1, by the way. He invaded Egypt with a strong force, with chariots and elephants and cavalry, and with a large fleet. He engaged Ptolemy, king of Egypt, in battle, and Ptolemy turned and fled before him, and many were wounded and fell, and they captured the fortified cities in the land of Egypt, and he plundered the land of Egypt. So First Maccabees, who's a different author, by the way, and a different point of view than Second Maccabees. But it says here, even those who eat his food, we're talking about the king of the south in Egypt again, shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. So those who are going to be close to Ptolemy see that he's not as strong as Antiochus, and so they're going to start betraying him, right? And this is kind of like how his army ends up being overpowered. And as far as the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil, mischief. This means that they actually were devising some sort of plan together. So Antiochus was doing in the meantime, before, all of, it's kind of like he took over Egypt, but he treated Ptolemy as kind of like hey, I rule over you, but we're in this together. And he's acting as his friend, basically. So, like you've seen stories in the Bible where like a king gets defeated, but they still give him the honor of eating at the king's table. They treat him like a dignitary. He's kind of doing that to Ptolemy. And Ptolemy is kind of like acting, kind of like going along with it. And they're actually kind of making plans together, right? They shall speak lies at the same table. So they're also like lying to each other, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be appointed. So Ptolemy, he was actually in the possession of Antiochus. Antiochus kind of like owns him now, right? But Antiochus was, quote, diplomatic with him, and they were concocting some sort of a plan together, apparently. Antiochus had his own agenda, however, and these plans never came through. So whatever they planning had or has its appointed time. So it's never made clear what they were, what kind of evil they were planning on doing, and what the appointed time is. So it's kind of a mystery verse. It's one of those things that, is there something that's going to happen like this in the future? I don't know. So, and he shall return to his land, and with great wealth, that his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. So yeah, Antiochus is going to, and now he's going to set his mind against the Holy Covenant. He's actually going to come against Jerusalem. So we're going to end with like this First Maccabees 1, which is kind of a summary. He goes, after subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in 143rd year. He went up against Israel, and he came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary, and he took the golden altar, the lampstands for the light, and all its utensils. He also took the table for the bread of the presence, the cup for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, the gold decoration on the front of the temple, and he stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold, the costly vessels. He also took the hidden treasures which he found. Taking them all, he departed into his own land. So he's going to go up into Syria. About this time, Antiochus made his second invasion of Egypt. This is so now I think we're in Second Maccabees. Okay, so kind of like to kind of get the same a feel of from the Second Maccabees. About this time, Antiochus made his second invasion into Egypt. And it happened that over all the city for almost 40 days, there appeared golden-clad horsemen charging through the air. So this is going to be another divine apparition sort of thing that's recorded here, right? There appeared golden-clad horsemen charging through the air in companies fully armed with lances and drawn swords. Troops of horsemen drawn up, attacks and counterattacks made on this side and on that, brandishing of shields, massing of spears, hurling of missiles, the flash of golden trappings, and armor of all sorts. Therefore, all men prayed that the apparition might prove to have been a good omen. So they were like, we don't know what this means, but we're just praying that this is going to be good, right? this is crazy because when Jerusalem falls to the Romans years later in AD 70, Josephus is going to record apparitions in the sky that are similar to this before that. And some people thought it was a good omen, some people thought it was a bad omen. The apparitions, there was a cross that appeared in the sky. There were like military people like calling out and rushing and horses and all this kind of stuff, a little bit like what this is, but Josephus records that around 66 AD, like shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem. So this apparently happens again.
What is it?
I don't know. I don't even know if it's true. It's just I just think it's like it's like there. But remember, there's the preterist will say, well, that's the signs in the heavens. You know, that there will be signs in the heavens, and you know all these kinds of things. And there were like some really freaky things that Josephus records. There was a birth of one of the heifers that they were going to slaughter for offering, gave birth to a lamb, like on the spot there. And just and there was like some guy named Jesus, but it was another Jesus walking around the city like declaring like destruction on Jerusalem, and he was very unpopular, and there's all this stuff going on. The city gates, where it would take like multiple men to like open the gate, open by itself, and there was like a lot of creepy things that like Josephus records. So anyway, so when a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no less than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault upon the city. When the troops on the wall had been forced back, and at last the city was being taken, Menelaus took refuge in the citadel. But Jason kept relentlessly slaughtering his fellow citizens, not realizing that the success at the cost of one's kindred is the greatest misfortune, but imagining that he was setting up trophies of victory over enemies and not over fellow countrymen, he did not gain the control of the government. However, in the end, got only disgrace from this conspiracy and fled into the country from the Ammonites. So I did something really weird here, like where I cut and paste something badly. This is like the continuation of the other story. I don't know.
Now, these are all Jews, right?
These are all Jews, yeah. So anyway, let me read this. Okay, when the news of what had happened reached the king, he took it to mean that the Judea was in revolt. So raging inwardly, he left Egypt and took the city by storm. And he commanded his soldiers to cut it down relentlessly, every one they met, and to slay those who went into the houses. So this is actually, we're back in 2nd Maccabees, and this is kind of like how he ends up attacking Jerusalem. Then there was a killing of young and old, destruction of boys and women and children, slaughter of virgins and infants. Within the total of 3 days, 80,000 were destroyed, 40,000 in hand-to-hand fighting. So 120,000 were killed, and as many were sold into slavery as were slain. Not content with this, Antiochus dared to enter the most holy temple in all the world, guided by Menelaus, who had become a traitor both to the laws and to his country. He took the holy vessels with his polluted hands and swept away with profane hands the votive offerings which other kings had made to enhance the glory and the honor of this place. So other kings had like donated to the temple, or given tax money to the temple so that they could build decorate it and everything. So Antiochus was elated in spirit, so it just means he was like haughty, and did not perceive that the Lord was angered for a little while because of the sins of those who dwelt in the city, and that therefore he was disregarding the holy place. So God is disregarding the holy place. But if it had not happened that they were involved in many sins, This man, Antiochus, would have been scourged and turned back from his rash act as soon as he came forward, just as Heliodorus was, whom Seleucus the king sent to inspect the treasury. But the Lord did not choose the nation for the sake of the holy place, but the place for the sake of the nation. Therefore, the place itself shared in the misfortunes that befell the nation and afterwards participated in its benefits. And what was forsaken in the wrath of the Almighty was restored again in all its glory when the great Lord became reconciled. So Antiochus carried off 1,800 talents from the temple and hurried away to Antioch, thinking in his arrogance that he could sail on the land and walk on the sea, because his mind was elated. And he left governors to afflict the people at Jerusalem. Philip, this other guy, they lorded it over the citizens, and even though some of them were Jews themselves. So
Where's Antioch again?
Antioch is in Asia Minor.
It's like if Jerusalem, if Israel's here, it's like in between Turkey. It'd be like in lower Turkey, or
Yeah,
Lebanon, somewhere like right there, I think, right?
Is
yeah,
that his home?
yeah. That's
that-
I think that's the. It's like
right
Alexandria in the south, and then Antioch in the north.
Cause
Well, that's
I wanna make sure I'm understanding, cause in Daniel, like, he's going to the north and the south and all that.
yeah.
So
Well,
when he goes to Antioch, he's going
yeah.
south or north?
North. Yeah. So Antioch, of course, named after Antiochus, right?
Okay.
So Antioch sent Apollonius, the captain of the Mysians, with an army of 22,000 and commanded him to slay all the grown men and to sell the women and boys as slaves. When this man arrived in Jerusalem, he pretended to be peaceably disposed. He's acting like he's their friend, and then waited until the holy Sabbath day. Then finally, the Jews not at work, he ordered his men to parade under arms. He put to the sword all those who came out to see them, and then rushed into the city with his armed men and killed great numbers of people. But then Judas Maccabeus and about 9 others got away into the wilderness, and he kept himself and his companions alive in the mountains as wild animals do, and they continued to live on what grew wild so that they might not share in defilement. So that's kind of like how the Maccabean revolt, or the name of these books, the Maccabees, is Maccabeus, starts a revolt or whatever.
Sounds out like Daniel 11, is that like verse 3rd?
So I am going, I'm kind of like leaving off, I was just kind of like jumping back and forth between the first Maccabees, second Maccabees, and Daniel, because Daniel's giving you one kind of like some of the things that are happening with Antiochus Epiphanes, but the way that they unfolded was recorded by the Jews, of course, one way. If you read other accounts, that might become, like from the Greeks' accounts of things and whatever else. But the story of the Maccabees is already, the reason I think that it has to be before at least the book of Hebrews is because the book of Hebrews, when it goes through the hall of faith, where it gets to the part where it's talking about some were tortured, some were, but they, but they were looking for a better resurrection and all this kind of stuff. A lot of commentators are like, well, this is all from Maccabees 7, 8, 9, stuff like that. And it does appear to be that way. So what you get, especially like I think in second Maccabees, is this idea that they did believe in a resurrection for sure. And really in Daniel, like they had the book of Daniel, but like for a long time already. And they're already seeing from Daniel, that, like you're going to see it in the next chapter, go your way, Daniel, because in the end, you're going to be resurrected and and you'll rest in peace, but you'll come back to life. So they did believe in a resurrection, you know, and so when there's going to be a handful of people who did not succumb to the Hellenistic way of life, and B, when they even under torture would hold on and say, you can kill us and torture us and everything, but we're going to be resurrected. So they were looking for a life after death, you know.
Because a lot of Jews don't believe in any life.
Yeah,
Like they don't believe in heaven and hell almost.
well, yeah, if you're talking about like say like the Sadducees, they didn't believe in a resurrection. Yeah. But so here,
I'll never forget that, they didn't believe in the resurrection.
yeah,
Because of that,
yeah. So I was listening to somebody today and they were talking about how the Jews saw that whole period of from like Daniel on up through the period, this period of Antiochus and the Maccabees into the Roman period as the Great Tribulation. And that John is seeing, he's extending that in like Revelation and saying that, yeah, these are still the Great Tribulation going on.
The temple being desecrated.
Yeah, but it's still kind of like I don't know how to put it all together, like in terms of like, well, it's since the body is the temple, and I understand why the temple had to go, the physical temple had to go, because we're dealing now with a new covenant, but there's a lot more continuity. I think that like I was raised a lot more with the idea of like you have the church and you have Israel. That's not the way that the early Christians were seeing it at all. It's like you can't just say that like Paul was converted into Christianity. Paul was just came to the realization that like, no, this Messiah who I've always believed in is that was Christ. And so he wasn't converted. He was in that sense, he didn't change religions. He and the way that John is seeing it too is like that when they're seeing the Gentiles come in, they're seeing that this was always supposed to happen. So okay, like I heard this story, I heard this kind of explained today. When you had the Pharaoh and the Egyptians come under the 10 plagues, right? In the land of Goshen, the water didn't turn into blood and there wasn't darkness, and it was, there was always like a distinction, right?
Wasn't that the land of milk and honey?
Yeah, well, it was within Egypt. It was kind of like the land of milk and honey. It was like the little Eden within, Egypt. But when the angel of death was going to, the last plague was going to come over Egypt, he says, and God says, and I will make a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And you're thinking, well, there's always been sort of like some kind of distinction with all of these plagues. But here's the thing, what's going to distinguish them is who puts the blood on the doorpost. It wasn't who's got this DNA or who's this skin color, right? It's who's putting the blood on the doorpost. If you were Jewish and you didn't put blood on the doorpost, you're Egypt, so to speak.
You're still gonna die.
You're still gonna die. And if you were an Egyptian and you're saying, I fear this God Yahweh and I'm going to practice this, guess what? you're going you're Israel and you're going to leave Egypt. So, you know, like in the next chapter, a couple chapters later, we see that there are a whole bunch of Egyptians who went along with them, people from Egypt. So,
I can see that.
yeah,
What are you doing? Why are you doing that?
yeah. So it's kind of like the distinction that's being made there is it's like, I'm going to make a distinction between Egypt and Israel, but that distinction is by who's going to put the blood on the doorpost. So later on, even in Israel's laws, it was if you have somebody who wants to become one of you, they get circumcised if they're male, you know, and they participate in the Passover. The Passover is what made you a brand new Israelite. If you were a female, you would marry an Israelite man, a circumcised man, and you would participate in the Passover. But it's that Passover that made you an Israelite in that sense. You know, so I don't know why I got on that, but that's kind of like what we call the church is just the assembly, and that word ecclesia is the assembly is what they called the Israelites whenever they'd gather and listen to Moses and his speeches or whoever, you know, it's just the same word, but there's not like really a distinction. It's just the people of God. And so when John is seeing, you know, in Revelation, it's like, I heard all the names, like, you know, all the names of these tribes and the number of them. And you're thinking these tribes don't even exist, most of them, right? And then when he looks, he sees them from all over the place and a number he can't even count. And they're from every nation, every tribe and tongue and everything. And they're all dressed like priests, you know? And so just like Isaiah had said, and they will become Levites, and they're going to be, you know, and it's like, how can like the Gentiles become Levites? They're not even Levites. Yeah, they're not even like Jewish. How can they, on top of that, become Levites? You know, so yeah, it's like God is seeing something much bigger in it, and so when we're talking about the Great Tribulation, I'm starting to have to rethink this a little bit, see if I even really agree, but there are some things that are making sense because I think that the New Testament writers saw themselves as being in the Great Tribulation.
Yeah.
Which is
You know?
understandable.
Which is understandable,
And
right?
really through all out of history, tons of people have all seen themselves probably as being in the tribulation. People getting burned at the stake in England, people
Right.
being executed in China, people.
Here, let me show you something like hold on. Let me find this real quick. And then
I was thinking, now my mind's being mischievous today, but more so visual. So we were talking. You know, Jesus was not a Christian.
well depending on what Christian means, because there's an interpretation that says that the Christian means anointed ones, because Christos means anointed one. Let me see. So if I what is it? 2 Thessalonians 3, I think. Okay, so this right here, this is Paul writing to the Thessalonians, right? He says in verse, this is Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians 1. He says, all this is evidence that God, okay, so we always thank God for you, brothers and sisters, and rightly so, because your faith is growing more and more, and the love of all of you you have for one another is increasing. Therefore, among God's churches, we boast about your perseverance in faith and all the persecutions and trials are enduring. So he's addressing that they are suffering and persecutions and trials, right? He says, all this is evidence that God's judgment is right, and as a result, you will be counted worthy of the kingdom of God for which you are suffering. God is just. He will pay back trouble to those who trouble you and give relief to you who are troubled, as to us as well. This will happen when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in blazing fire and with his powerful angels. He will punish those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. They will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of. This is my point here. We think of like the great tribulation as something that happens there at the end, and that God takes vengeance for it then, right? But he is addressing people in the first century there, as you are going through this tribulation, and Christ upon his return is going to repay these people back. It doesn't fit the timeline that like a lot of times you're given, right? It's like this isn't like something that's secluded to like the end times, so to speak.
No, I don't think that it is. I think that the tribulations are more so for us, the followers, rather than the ungodly. Because the ungodly don't.
No, it's not tribulation for them.
That's not true. Yeah, exactly. The tribulations are for us, and we have to.
Well,
Where do we get the 7-year tribulation idea from?
the 70th week of Daniel idea, but even there, it was kind of like it's talking about the whole 70 years as a tribulation period.
Yeah,
So and then if you're talking about those 7 years, there's really only 3.5 years that are focused on as like the Antichrist or doing like all his murderous things. But it seems that like that in that 7-year period, everything would be okay up until the 3.5 year point, if you're interpreting it that way. I don't.
But it's weird. It's like not even. That's how I've always heard it. But then I'm like, why is that 7 years of tribulation if the first 3.5 were fine?
There's nothing there that says that.
Yeah.
Right. There's nothing there that says that.
Give you this idea lately in a lot of different.
I know something.
Oh, go for it.
You're talking about that 7 years. We'll see when Israel got all corrupted and everything, and they're following idols. Well, the land never rested for 7 years. So you have a lot of time too equated to that. The land was going to rest. And because even they were still farming and all that during the wars and all that stuff that they were doing.
Well, yeah.
And I know that's going to contribute to that time. It could be a lot longer. I don't know.
But what he's. But that's what the exile, the 70-year exile is about. You know, and maybe there's a thought there that like, well, if you have a great tribulation, it would be 7 years by default of like things always seem to come in sevens. You know.
Yeah. I just know it's one of his favorite numbers.
You know that what now?
He thought it was one of his favorite numbers.
Oh yeah. But there's something about 3.5 too. Like there's some
Half of the
Oh, yeah, it's in the middle.
yeah, it's the half of a 7. Yeah, right. Yeah. So I think like when you're seeing like these are those who come out of the Great Tribulation, that it might just have in view not just like some period, you know, like that's a short amount of period, but a great tribulation that's lasted the entire exile.
Yeah, well, also, I think it has to do with the time because, it talks about God's day being 1,000 years. Well, since the beginning from Eve to now, is that like almost 6,000 years?
Mm.
And
Yeah, we've lost track of God's time.
I'm just saying, like,
You know what I mean? It just, we don't
you
see time. for
figure
it.
this time out. That could be, at that I don't think we're quite at 6,000. We might still be a couple God years away. I don't know.
We're close to the end of the 6,000.
But
We're
but
almost
the
coming to the
tribulation, is supposed to happen, I think, when we reach like about 6,000 years, I think. I don't know. It's just stuff I've thought about. It's just out there.
From what I've gathered, I think we're almost at the end of the 6th day, going into the 7th day, I think. If you look at it like that.
Uh-huh.
Come on, Mark. Waiting for you to say something about.
Oh, the day of rest is when we rule with Christ, basically. It's more, I see it's a theme more than, like something that you can like chalk up like to some kind of a timeline and attribute, like this many years or days or anything like that.
Well,
or
it's
even
God's
thousands of
time.
years.
It won't be on our linear clock. It's on God's time.
Well,
Right.
so
I know I can't outguess God.
it's when you built a temple, you did it like in 7 stages, and the way that it's portrayed in Genesis is that God builds this cosmic temple, so to speak, and then puts the image, which is the living image, humans, in it. And when he rests, we think of him, all we think about is him ceasing from his work, but that rest is him sitting and ruling.
And it's like enjoying.
And also just being at rule. So like when you're talking, the Garden of Eden is the same thing really as like the temple or the Holy of Holies. It's the ruling space. So when the writer of Hebrews is talking about us entering into God's rest, it's not just, like it's not just resting and enjoying the things of Eden. But it's also to sit in the ruling position, because that's kind of what a ruler did, right? They ordered they put things in order, and then they take their seat on the throne and rest, and enjoy their labors, but it's a position of ruling. So we think of like these numbers as in, like these timelines, but it's not really so much about the timelines as the themes behind them.
Well, I remember, speaking of timeline, I remember in the Old Testament survey class
Mhm.
with Nancy Heidebrecht. And she's somebody who goes to Israel all the time, really good friends with the Jewish people there. Had quite a better grasp on Hebrew mentality and how they define their terms. It was eye-opening to me. But she was talking in regards to, like, say, the 7 days of creation.
Yeah.
That in like a Hebrew kind of a understanding of the word day, it just means when the
Something's
time has
completed.
been, how long that time has taken to be completed.
Yeah, it's a time of
Like,
completion.
So now that's day one,
Uh-huh.
but it doesn't mean that, it's a 24-hour period. So
Right.
we can't really track things in the same way that we're used to tracking them when we're reading scripture on time.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know, I feel like I've arrived at this idea that I think God was very literal about creation.
Yeah,
I used to think like a lot of those systems of nature couldn't survive without the other systems of nature for 1,000 years. Like certain land animals needed the birds, or the plants needed the animals to pollinate them and all that stuff. Like you couldn't have 1,000 years of like one thing without another. I'm not saying though, like, I think like in Daniel where he's talking about all those periods, it could be described like that. I just always think for creation, I think it's. I think a lot of that's come into the Western mentality too, is since the advent of evolution. Cause evolution has come to like the forefront, from science and education. So it's almost like Christians are kind of trying to, well, maybe Jewish people too. Like, oh, well, yeah, it's possible, because maybe those days. Maybe that was millions and millions of years, because it's almost like I feel like sometimes like. The Christian and religious world is trying to fit with the secular world, like of science, like. Oh, well, yeah, because then evolution could happen if everything was thousands of years.
I used to really believe in evolution, but I'm getting to more where that makes less sense. And most of the indigenous peoples around the world all have their creation stories, and they're all
Flood
basically
stories.
told the same.
And they all have flood stories too.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of don't come up with the same stuff all over the world by chance. And evolution's relatively new.
Yes, and so is the rapture.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like the way I see it is that like whenever we're trying to, I think a lot of like our interpretations are trying to address evolution and science and modern thought. The Bible wasn't written in that time and isn't addressing those things,
No.
I don't think at all.
Yeah,
And so what the terminology that's being used and the pictures that are being used are things that you would understand if you were living thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
So it's going to be the things that are said there are like in Genesis, it rhymes with the what do you call it, the paganism of the time.
yeah,
So it's kind of like, because it's polemic, or however you want to describe it. It's saying you think that the cosmos is like that, and it's using a model that they would have understood, and it's not scientific necessarily, but it's turning the thing on its head, saying this is different than what you guys are thinking, guy, but it's still using the same kind of patterns.
what I've been doing, and I've been talking to people about this too lately, is like. We read into the Bible like what we've already heard, like. I heard about the rapture. Like as a kid before I really started studying the Bible as an adult. I kind of got like. The ideas of a lot of people, if you grew up in public school, you already had this idea of what evolution was. As a teenager, before you started studying the Bible. I think for me, like even speaking in tongues, I kind of got it broken down to me, bullet pointed before I really started studying the Bible. So then when you start actually as an adult studying the Bible, you're kind of viewing all these different things through the lenses of something you already,
Different issue.
it's already like buried in your head. And then like when I don't
So
know.
do you mean that like you have to, when you start reading it, you have the idea in your head and you read the Bible, but it's different than what you thought?
You're kind of like forming the Bible into these different things you've already.
Categories
Yes.
these
Yeah.
pre-existing categories that you have.
The big rapture. When I read it, I don't remember if it's in Luke or Matthew or what book where he's like a thief in the night. It'll be as in the days of Noah and all this stuff.
Right,
In the days of Noah, the evil people were swept away,
right.
not the good people. And then I'm like, how did anyone read that they were going to be raptured at all? It's obviously talking about. I think when he's saying that, he's talking about all the wrath that the angels are going to pull out, the bowls and the trumpets and all that. That's what's going to sweep away.
Right.
The people like a thief in the night, not like the good people are going to be swept away. And so, and right now I'm like reading Acts too, and I'm just like tripping out about speaking in tongues, and I'm really trying to read it like with a blank slate of a mind.
Mhm.
And not like what I've seen or heard from a million people, and I think though, like evolution, it's sad, is like. So many people become Christians after they've already gone through college and stuff,
Mhm.
and then they're trying to fit the Bible into the evolution. Like when,
Yeah.
like in Job, when he describes Behemoth and Leviathan, they're like totally dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs.
Yeah, but like, they're like, oh, well, evolution taught me the dinosaurs couldn't have been around, so.
But
Until,
then, but I think but you're still addressing things in terms of evolution when you're talking about dinosaurs in the Bible, because in the ancient mind they're not thinking about dinosaurs when you're talking about Behemoth or Leviathan.
Because they were familiar with it.
well, why do you think they weren't? thinking about
Because they were
dinosaurs?
talking about the chaos monsters.
Yeah, but like, when he says the tail is like as thick as the
Yeah, he
cedar,
got
and
pretty, it wasn't
and
so much,
it has armor that can't be pierced by a spear.
yeah,
think he's
that's more
describing
literal, I think.
a very
rather than-
real animal that they would have all understood. And I've studied it too. The word dinosaur wasn't even invented until I think it was like the late 17th or 18th century.
Mhm.
All the dictionaries had the word dragon in its place, and they would say, like, I've seen dictionaries from like the 1500s that said dragon, a very rare but large dangerous reptile. And like, the word dinosaur is fairly new, so like,
Thunder lizard.
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I think I would. Now, I'm not saying that like Leviathan can't also be representing, like we say the devil is the serpent. Well, of course, I think if there were dinosaurs that they saw with their eyes, of course you're gonna compare the devil to that too, or like the evil one to like Leviathan. So I don't think it's the Nakash, or however you say, like, too, like the
Yeah.
Hebrew word for like the serpent or whatever. I don't think it's like we use this metaphors all the time, like the roaring lion. I don't think it's incorrect that that could be referring to an evil deity or whatever either, but I also think, like, it's interesting as cultures all over the world have a idea about fire breathing dragons or serpents. I mean, there's bugs that like spray out chemicals that make like a fire. I don't think it's totally. I don't think that, like, a lot of myths all have some element of truth to them. Well, I guess what I'm saying is, according to evolution, dinosaurs and humans never lived together. But when you look at a lot of evidence, even in Peru, there's these Nazca stones where people have like carvings, like where they have like triceratops on like reins and stuff.
Mhm.
And so it's like,
They're riding them.
yeah, they're writing them and stuff. And so, and how would they have known about them even? And so it's like, I think like when we read into Leviathan and Behemoth, if you didn't know about evolution, that people and dinosaurs never lived together, it sounds like exactly like a dinosaur. And people try to say it's an elephant or a hippo, but it says the tail was like as big as a cedar. Well, elephants and hippos all have tiny little tails. I don't know. So I guess like that's what I mean, where I think we read into it like not with a virgin mindset, you know, we already have all these
They're
great.
not like children, they're not children.
Yeah,
It says believe as a child. And what does a child do? You tell a child something, he believes.
so like if you told a child to draw Behemoth,
They
it would
don't
draw
know
a
what
big
to do.
tail.
Yeah.
It would probably kind of look like a dinosaur, like not like whatever. But I think we do this with all kinds of things. Like, I've been thinking about that about speaking in tongues a lot lately. Like, I've been more quiet about it publicly sometimes because I want to like collect all the information about it that I can find and then make more of a decision about like when it's appropriate and not and stuff. Because I think I always just kind of accepted what different people told me and never really like
Checked it out.
yeah, kind of like that. And I think we do it with a lot of things in the Bible.
I don't know, I think that the praying in tongues, speaking in tongues, for me it's praying, but it's also good talking about cab drivers.
Like I've told that to a couple people recently, like when they're like, well, I think it's only for like in other languages. And I just read an Acts where they were surprised about the Gentiles, and it says
Mhm.
they received the Holy Spirit because even they were speaking in tongues. I think it specifically says in foreign languages or other languages.
Yeah, I said in other languages. I was surprised one time because like I said, I usually use it to pray. You know, sometimes you don't know what to pray. So
Yeah.
you go to tongues and that seems to cover it. But one day I was walking probably at the Antique Swap Meet in Long Beach, and I heard these people talking, And they were saying the same words.
Hmm.
They were just talking. It kind of blew my mind. You know what I
Can
mean?
you tell what ethnicity they look like?
I don't remember.
I always think that
I
tongues,
think they were Middle Eastern of some sort, but
I always think that tongues must be what God like spoke the universe into existence in, you know, like, cause
it's very
there
possible.
wasn't a language yet. There wasn't Hebrew
Or
yet, I don't
maybe,
think.
or maybe tongues was before Babel was built.
Well, the second chapter of Acts where you have the first speaking in tongues there is a reflection of Babel. It's Babel reverse. Because
Interesting.
yeah, it's like the calling back of the nations. So I mean there's like a lot going on there, but part of the message is that when God divided the nations, which was at the Tower of Babel, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God.
70, right?
Huh?
70.
70, yeah.
It's interesting when Jesus sends out the 70.
Yeah, he sends out the 70.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And that's to get all the tribes back, basically, and then he
It's
sent
yeah.
out the 12 of the people of Israel.
So where he had divided them into and confused their tongues, he divided them among the lesser gods or the rebel gods or whatever, the sons of God. And then he confused their languages and he set their borders and all that. But now he's calling all nations to him. Just like when Paul was saying, you know, in Acts 17, you know, he goes to Athens, he says, you know, when God, you know, divided the nations, he set their borders, but now he's commanding all men to come to him and to believe in Christ, right? And because Christ is being given the nations. And so, you know, the ministry of reconciliation, or that ministry, the gospel was, you know, like preach it in Judea, in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world. So when they were coming from the ends of the world, because these are the same areas that like are mentioned in the scattering of nations, you know, they're all of a sudden hearing, and the way that Luke puts it is divided tongues of fire came
Yeah,
on
what does
them.
it mean divided?
Divided
Yeah.
so it's kind of like the way he divided the nations.
By their tongues.
Now you've got like the presence of God, the fire that went into the temple, went into the tabernacle, never came back after exile, because Antiochus Epiphanes walks into the temple and desecrates the Holy of Holies, but there's no fire there to consume him, right? You know, like that never happened in Ezekiel's temple. So the question had always been like, we must still be in exile because the fire has not returned into the temple again, right?
What do they mean
But-
by the fire?
The fire, the presence of God, is
Presence
that
of
tangible presence
Holy
of God.
Spirit.
But now all of a sudden you've got the tangible presence of God, that fire split up and landing and identifying the people in the upper room as the temple of God, where God is going to reside. He's going to reside in them.
Kind of like representative of.
Yeah,
God.
and they are talking in divided it's like tongues, like it's Babel again, but now it's reversed. God is calling the nations that were scattered to come back to him, and he's going to reside and be in their presence. So the idea of now I think it gets expanded from there, because Paul, he says something like, when he talks about, but you know, love or whatever, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels that have not love, I am nothing, you know. So I think there was maybe an idea that you know, like you could speak in the tongues of men miraculously, but you could also speak in the tongues of angels or whatever that means.
Yeah, I'm always
you know.
thinking, maybe he just meant that too, is like. an extreme
Maybe he's just
metaphor,
using that
like
poetically, I don't know, but you know.
Well, it's interesting because I used to always think of only when I was younger, from what I've heard from church, is only the Holy Spirit manifesting, was like when people would speak in tongues, but in the Old Testament, it would say the Spirit of God came upon him and then he did this and he ran forever. Then like Jesus, when I don't remember if it's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, maybe it's in John, I don't remember if it's in all the gospels. But before he ascended, it says like about the disciples and he breathed into them.
Hmm.
And the spirit, and they were filled
Oh,
with
yeah,
the
gave him the
spirit.
spirit.
Yeah, and it's weird, the word breathe is the same
Yeah.
word that in Genesis, the same Hebrew word. When
And they got 'em.
yeah,
Well, it would be the
Making Adam.
Septuagint, the Greek.
yeah, but it's so like it's the same
It's the Septuagint's translations of the
Hebrew.
Hebrew, yeah. That would
So-
be used there.
it would have been like the same word that God, and so like he gave them the Holy Spirit already. And then it, like, there's several places where it seems like people had already had the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
before the Pentecost.
Hmm.
And I don't know, it's just, but, and then like, it's interesting, like, the Gentiles, they received the Holy Spirit first. And then he said, oh, now go get them baptized.
Hmm.
And sometimes it seems like we always have this order, like, you get saved, then you get baptized, then you receive, I don't know. Just,
Hey,
I did it the other way. I got baptized after having the seed.
can I change gears back to
Yeah.
something you said?
sure, we're all over the place. right?
Yeah, yeah.
I love it though.
No, it's cool. Maybe I should stop recording. I don't know.
I was thinking.
I'll probably edit out the last